Okay, hello Year 11. Welcome to your next GeogPod. Today we're going to be looking through side one of dynamic development, one of those human topics from, what is it, paper two, sir, isn't it? So we're going to have a little look through this. Obviously on this side, it's going to be like the key ideas and the key theories. And then on the next side is going to be where we start to look at the more sort of detailed stuff, some case studies and that sort of thing. But obviously with dynamic development, we want to delve in straight away and really recap what do we mean by the term development. So, Mr. Hatchell, what can you tell me about development? What is it?
Thank you, Mr. Knight. So, development is essentially thinking about how people's standard of living improve. So, how people's lives can improve and become better over time with, for example, food, shelter, water. So, we're really looking at how living standards can be made better over time using resources. And there's three essential levels of this we look at, and they are economic, social, and environmental. Now, you may remember those words from SEEP: social, economic, environmental, and political. So you can think of it like that. We look at them through the realms of these different factors within a society. So when we talk about economic, we're thinking about the economy's growth. That might be a local economy or a national one. So we're also thinking about industry and manufacturing and technology and how they drive improvements in the economy and people's general level of wealth. When we talk about social, then, we're thinking about people's actual standard of living, their actual lives, and what they have access to. So that might be whether they have access to clean water, or electricity, or shelter, or even literacy rates. And then for environmental, we're thinking about the environment and landscape and nature. And so we're thinking about managing that environment because although we're trying to create economic growth, we also want to ensure that we're protecting habitats and our environment for our own use. So we're trying to protect that environment over time. So essentially development then looks at all of the different aspects you might think about in a country and people's lives as well and tries to improve them. And also then, when we think of development, we're trying to think about the different types of countries. Okay, so this is a really important aspect of the entire GCSE course that you need to know, not just in dynamic development. And there are three categories of country that we categorize countries into. And they are ACs, EDCs, and LIDCs. Now, there is a map, if you tilt your head, you can see it very clearly, of the ACs, EDCs, and LIDCs in the world. ACs, remember, are the wealthiest of nations. They have a high GNI per capita, which is gross national income. Think of that as wealth. And they have high living standards as well. So if we think of some of the ACs in the world, that includes most of Europe and North America, and also Australia and New Zealand as well. Okay, so these are the richest nations of the world. We then have EDCs. Now think of these as middle countries. These are countries that are growing rapidly, but are not quite advanced yet. They're not quite wealthy yet. There are some individual issues still within those countries. So this is where we have a big secondary industry sector. If we think about UK 21st century and link back to the different types of jobs, we had primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. These EDCs have a lot of secondary jobs. Okay, so they have a lot of manufacturing jobs. They make most of the world's goods and materials, and they are growing rapidly. And then finally, we have the poorest of the nations, which are LIDCs. And so again, if we look at the map here, that is most of Africa and some of the Asian countries too. And these are nations with very low wealth per person in that nation, and standards of living are generally quite low. And that's not to say everybody in the nation is poor. It's just to say that there is a majority there of a problem in terms of the amount of wealth or income people have. Now, in terms then of how we measure development, Mr. Knight, I'm going to hand over to you now for how we actually look at ways in which we can measure this development in nations.
Excellent. So this will link over to where Mr. Hatch was talking about our social and economic earlier in terms of how we measure that development. So we can use indicators to have a look at those. And like indicators in a car give us a directional understanding of what a car might do. Well, indicators will tell us how developed or what is the quality of life like within a country. So they're really, really important. And there are two main branches we look at: economic and social. So as you can see on the slide, if for economic, we look at employment and then GDP and GNI. Obviously, your employment links back to, as Mr. Hatchell said, about the UK 21st, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary industries. So maybe if you need a bit of recap of that, go back to UK 21st, maybe things like the Clark-Fisher model. But obviously, we also see a link between employment sectors and those ACEDC countries. If we think about Brazil, India, China, those sort of places, they've got very large secondary industries to a point as well. Whereas if we think back to places like Zambia, we investigated that country as part of dynamic development, and obviously it had more primary. So just you might be able to pick up that there's a bit of a theme there going on. But in terms of the other two terms, and often I find my students find it hard to remember which ones and which. But two key things we remember. Well, gross means total. Some of you might use it in business, so like gross and net profit, for example. Then the other keywords are obviously either product or income, okay? So product is obviously about goods and services. So think about the word produce. So how much does a country produce with regards to its economy? So goods, services, imports, exports, that sort of kind of thing. Whereas income, very clearly, is all about the wealth of the individual. So the average wage, if you so wish. So we can see how wealthy its people are, and also look at the strength of its economy by looking at GDP. The only other thing you might want to note is per capita is simply a fancy word for saying per person. So it's just two significant ways you might see in your exam that look at the wealth of a country. But the key thing is you just know that they link to how well off or how well developed a country may be. In terms of social indicators, you've probably come across these plenty of times already. Now, if you think about HGI later on. So infant mortality is all about the number of children who die before reaching 1 per 1,000. Okay, and the reason why that would be a good indicator is obviously that support and care that we're able to survive through medicines, vaccines, and aftercare for both parents and their children really signify how well developed a country may be. The literacy rate, obviously a really key indicator, how many of the population over the age of 15 can read and write. So a really good one to indicate how well developed the country's education system is. For life expectancy, well, obviously that's got a wide range of links, doesn't it? In terms of health, access to education, and obviously the big one, quality of healthcare, doesn't it? And then again, if you think back to things like UK 21st, where we looked at population pyramids and things like the demographic transition model, there's a nice overlap there as well. So the key thing from all of this is in the topic, we also investigated, well, what's the issue with just looking at economic measures? And you might remember where we looked at there's something called the Brandt line. So if you quickly go up to that little map again very, very quickly, is that we looked at how the Brandt line divided the world into the rich northern hemisphere and the poor south minus New Zealand and Australia as our anomalies. Okay, and actually what we found is that just looking at countries rich and poor, and you maybe hopefully remember the lesson you did maybe even year 9, where you worked out that that isn't a good way, that it's not as simple as that. We can have some reasonably wealthy countries that don't have a good quality of life. So this is where HDI comes in and potentially solves that problem. Okay, so it looks at a mixture of economic and social indicators. If you look into this more, there's a real weighting about how much goes into it. But the key thing for you to remember is that it uses life expectancy, education, both the mean years actually covered and the expected years, and the income as well. So it gives us a nice rounder picture. It means we can have a nice clear picture of how well developed a country is and not have data skewed just by maybe if they've got, if it's an oil rich country, for example. So we get a proper view of how well developed a country is. Some other things you might want to investigate, it's on a scale of 0 to 1, okay? If you go away and have a little look on, search on Google, you can find out which country is currently top, and I think you'd find that really interesting. But also we talked about advantages and disadvantages of using that method as well. So in your own revision, that's something you'll probably come across as well. But otherwise, we'll keep that nice and short there. So that's how we might measure our levels of development via economic, social, and the Human Development Index.
Thank you, Mr. Unite. So, shall we move on to the Rostow model, sir?
Sounds good.
So do you want me to take over?
Yeah, go on. Oh no, was that part of mine? Yeah, okay, go for it. Yeah, I love that. Boom. So yeah, Rostow's model. Okay, and we'll see a picture of this on the next slide as well. But if you need to quickly go back to your books, it's a 5-stage. I mean, it's nothing super exciting. It goes in a perfectly positive correlation. I think even Mr. Hatchell might potentially be flicking here. Yeah, wow, this is some quality support from Mr. Hatchell. So there are 5 particular stages we need you to be aware about of this. Okay, and the stages are 1, traditional society; 2, preconditions for takeoff; 3, takeoff; 4, drive to maturity; and 5, mass consumptions. And again, we'll find all of our countries' ACs, EDCs somewhere along these lines. And obviously, the closer you are to 1, okay, you're going to find the less developed country. But for number 1, that's all about our traditional society. So arguably not even necessarily an LIDC as such. We're thinking about people who are maybe subsistence living. So we looked at that in sustaining ecosystems, and we looked at the indigenous people of the rainforest who subsist off the land. And the key thing for the word subsistence means they only provide enough food for themselves and their community. It's not grown on a commercial basis for profit. So it's all about, living off the land. So that's what we would find in traditional society. In our preconditions for takeoff, okay, we start to find that infrastructure is invested in. And a recap of the term infrastructure is all about those key things that involve, quality of life to improve. So good quality roads. We've got hospitals, railways, things that help the economy to both grow, but also supports, access to healthcare and things like that. And that's where those things start to appear. So definitely we might see LIDCs in that section. In number 3, takeoff, where we see the word industrialization, we think, well, hang on a minute, that's the secondary sector. So we're probably going to be thinking about EDC style countries, Brazil, China with their industry. In the UK, if you go back to the Clark-Fisher model, when did we have that industrial period? So essentially you're thinking about your factories, your processing, your secondary stage. For number 4, we have drive to maturity. And obviously when you're mature, again, if you think about whether it's in age and maturity of the tree and you reach your full growth, well, that's what we're striving to. So this is where we start to see those AEC countries appear. So the economy is stronger, so people are wealthier, and we see higher standards of living. So if we flip that back to indicators, life expectancy would be going up, we'd have lower infant mortality rates, those sort of things. And last but not least, obviously the final stage where we have mass consumption. And obviously, when we think about consumption, you might think, oh, food, that's your natural thought. But it's also to do with, the amount of energy, so gas, electric, water that you consume, and obviously to do with trading as well. So our very advanced countries where they've got the ability to literally click onto Amazon potentially and bring something into that country elsewhere. You've got your cars, you've got your houses, you've got that high level of consumption within your country. Okay, so there's very few barriers or restrictions to what you can access with regards to food and other sort of economic things that we've talked about so far. So what we want to know that now then is, well, how do countries move through? What things might restrict a country's ability to move through the Rostow model? And there are both physical and human factors to look at here. Mr. Hatchell, what are the physical factors?
Thank you, Stuart. So, as Mr. Unite said, we essentially want to look at what affects the ability of a country to develop, what stops it or restricts it from developing. So, there are 4 different ways on the screen for you, and they are natural resources, natural hazards, climate, and location or the landscape type, the terrain. Now, we're not going to look at all 4 of these in detail, but I would suggest that you do have a good knowledge of 3 of them. Okay, so I'm going to start with natural resources. So, if a country has a good access to fuel, it might naturally have its own fuel resources, such as oil. It might also naturally have metals and minerals that it can extract to be able to produce fuel. It might also have rainforest that it can get timber from, so that it can create logging from, which then gets the timber they can create furniture and buildings from. And also if it has the access to things like safe water. These 4 elements here, if a country has all of those and has a good abundant supply of them, the likelihood is they will be able to develop well. However, if they have a restriction on some of these or all of them, if they don't have good access to them, then it is likely that that country will be slow to develop. And it's sort of similar then for natural hazards. So if there is a risk of tectonic hazards like earthquakes or volcanoes, then it might restrict the country's ability to develop really well. If you think about Haiti, and that's one of our case studies for global hazards back in your first topic of year 10, that's one of the ways in which Haiti has struggled to develop over time. But it also can benefit from volcanic material and flood water, because we know that the ash from a volcano has good chemicals in it for soil, which helps the growth of crops on farmland. So that can also be beneficial. But hazards, as I said, can frequently undermine development. They can frequently stop a country in its tracks from being able to invest regularly, because they may be having to receive aid and help in actually mitigating against the problems that the hazard has caused. Another one just to mention is climate. So the availability of rainfall and frequent rainfall is really important for farming, for example. And it will benefit farmers if there is frequent rainfall. However, if we're in an area such as the Sahara or the Sahel deserts, or anywhere tropical as well, there is other problems with too much rainfall or too little in some cases as well. Extreme climates, as I've just mentioned, they can affect other things in social factors like health, because diseases can spread more easily in those climates that have more extreme high types of temperatures. And then finally, climate also, as we know, attracts tourists. So even though tourism to the UK is high, it's not extremely high consistently throughout the summer because we don't have a high temperature consistently throughout the summer. And we also have higher rainfall totals than somewhere like the coast of South Spain, where there is really high temperatures throughout the summer and it's generally dry. So climate can also impact the ability of a country to develop its tourist industry, for example. There is another one there, which is location of terrain. I'm not going to go through that in detail with you. If you feel like you want to look at that one, please do. It does mention things like being landlocked and mountainous and so forth. So they are just 3 physical factors that can affect development. Anything to add, Mr. Unite?
No, that was really good, sir. I mean, I think a nice little link here is where we think about those natural resources. A country might have those raw materials, but it might not have the technology to extract them. So that's where it can maybe get stuck, in that sort of stage 2 of the Rostow model, and often rely on, like we looked at Zambia, on other countries or TNCs, like China and specific companies to help them extract that as well. So again, I think that's a really good point to really think about the things that might restrict that further development. So I'm going to have a look at some human factors then. And again, as you can see, there's 6 here. I'm going to try and just pick 3. Okay, I'm going to look at politics, trade, and history. I think they're ones that, when I've taught it, are the ones that come up really, really heavily and have got a lot of stuff that we can use. So if we start with politics, well, we always go back to the idea of, well, how effective is a country's government? Is it corrupt or is it quite efficient? Does it invest properly into a country's sort of infrastructure? And obviously we could use HDI for this as well, because if we think about the HDI scale, well, a government that is likely to be investing in its people and improving development would likely have high rates of, education and life expectancy. So there is a little link there. And again, if they're investing in services and infrastructure, the country is likely to benefit and see improvements in quality of life. Again, that investment doesn't just have to be on roads and infrastructure. It could be on schools, hospitals, those things as well. And obviously, if a country is not run smoothly, well, how do we know where that money goes? Does it all get invested properly? Where we look at top-down versus bottom-up, that's another theme there. That how do we know that a government will invest the money it's given in effective places and spending it on the right things? So again, when we start to look at the next one for trade, well, obviously, landlocked, which appeared in that terrain one before, is an interesting one. Is that typically the best form of trade has always been sort of oceans to a degree. It allowed countries to develop before we had aeroplanes and stuff like that. So it's always traditionally been rivers and the seas that allow us to trade so easily. But if you're a landlocked country, well, are you restricted by that? Well, potentially yes, 100%. We looked at that as a negative before. For Zambia, though, I think it's surrounded by 8 other countries. So on the flip side, you've got potential countries nearby. And if we think about the UK as when we were part of the EU, the strong advantage of that was that they were right on our doorstep. So we can think about, proximity to countries and that sort of stuff within it as well. But what we really want to think about is those relationships and being part of trading groups. And that's why often if you watch the news, things like free trade agreements and being part of whether it's the EU, that sort of stuff is really important for a country to help its development. But again, links to the politics, because if a country doesn't have a suitable government, they might not be allowed to be part of those trading groups. And obviously, if we think about our primary, secondary, tertiary sectors of jobs, well, where's the most amount of money? Even if you go back to your chocolate bar when you did sustaining ecosystems and development, think about how much money goes via fair trade. Well, most of the money is at the top end. The services is where the most amount of money is. So for a country to develop, they want to get to those points where they have more jobs in that area. They're not going to make as much money or wealth by solely being around those raw materials, which is why a country will want to strive and move forward through those Rostow models. Again, as you can see, education and health do play a part. How well educated your population is going to impact on the type of jobs they can have. Are they spending time off work ill? How much money you put into the healthcare is all going to play a part. And obviously, aid really quickly. If you're servicing debt or you're relying on aid, that's going to impact on your ability to fully develop your own country. So you can read through those 3 in a bit more detail shortly after this. But otherwise, why I picked history is obviously for a lot of you think about colonialism and the impact and exploitation that had. Okay, in particular on Africa as a continent, which I showed really nicely in Mr. Hatchell's map earlier. So when we talk about uneven development, obviously Africa is significantly impacted because that was arguably the continent that suffered most from colonialism. That actually that exploitation, that taking of those raw materials to the more wealthy continents such as Europe and North America. Some of you may remember the gold digger image in the lessons where those coins are all piled up over North America and Europe, and yet Africa's literally been dug out, and there's a few handful of coins which shows it really, really nicely. And one final thing is obviously countries that went through industrialization a while ago have now developed further. So they've got that advantage. They've had that leg up with that cost. And there's other countries that are playing catch up. So that again links back to that concept of uneven development. And with that, that leads on to Mr. Hatchell's final little section where we look at the consequences of uneven development.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So with the consequences of uneven development, this is a really, really useful thing to remember when trying to remember this whole topic, and just some key rules about what the difference is between developed and underdeveloped, or AC and LIDC nations. So what we're looking at here essentially is levels of development differing in different countries. So they are different, and that has an impact on things like wealth and health and education. And wealth, health and education are three very simple broad aspects of a country's level of development. So we know that, for example, with wealth, people in more developed nations like ACs generally have higher incomes and therefore generally are wealthier. Whereas in less developed countries, they generally have lower incomes and therefore are less wealthy. With health, we know that in an AC country, or even some of the top EDC countries, they will have better healthcare. And better healthcare will mean that people live longer. And that will mean there is generally overall more wealth as well in a nation. So they link together. And those less developed nations, those LIDCs, generally don't have good access to the vaccines and the drugs to treat certain illnesses. And therefore, there's higher death rates and there is less wealth overall. And finally, with education as well, we know that better educated workforces and nations generally create more wealth because they are more educated. They go into the top super tertiary and quaternary jobs. Those countries that are less developed and that do have less wealth generally also have less of a good educational system too. And they generally don't have as many children in their education system as the UK or America would do. So they're just three simple categories to try and remember when we think about what happens in a nation because of this uneven development. What's the difference between an LIDC and an AC? Mr. Unite, have you got anything to add before we finish up?
No, I think that's really good. I think we smashed through that nicely. There's a few key concepts, a few key terms, key physical and human factors, and then Rostow's model. So I think there's definitely plenty for them to get their teeth into and get some revision done.
Brilliant. Well, that's the first part of dynamic development done. So that's basically all the theory and the ideas behind development. The next GeogPod, which you will see after this, hopefully, will be on mainly our case study of Zambia. So thank you very much for watching. Look out for the next one, and we will see you soon.
See you later.